when Christians read the Bible, when kind of laymen, when average folks read the Bible, they start at the first New Testament book, which is the Matthew birth narrative, and they read A to Z Matthew, and then Mark, which historically Mark's first. Actually, Mark's the earliest gospel. They put Matthew at the front because of that nativity scene. So Matthew, front to back, Mark, Luke, and then John, front to back. When you read it like that, it all sounds kind of similar. It's very much Jesus goes around and preaches and heals some people, and he's killed, and comes back to different audiences. It's really not that different. But so what Bible scholars have really been doing over the last about 150 years, 200 years, is they started taking what's called vertical reading. So that first style is called horizontal reading. And they'll vertical read the same event in multiple gospels.
So you're reading it across all four.
So you're reading it across, and you're
or
saying,
you can.
Very little are in all
John,
four. John's its own whole thing, which we'll discuss. But you can see kind of what's called the evolution of the Jesus character, or de-evolution, whatever you want to call it, the changes of the Jesus character. When I say Jesus character, I don't mean he's not real.
Yeah.
But
you see the deification.
You see the deification.
In John. And I think there are beautiful, and I'd love to hear your take on that. We're unpacking this, but I think there are beautiful takes on that. Like, John was the closest to Jesus, right? According to the Bible, right?
Well, according to his version.
to be fair, but you see this even in the other Gospels. Like, he was the one that laid on Jesus' bosom at the supper.
Yeah,
the
so
the one who I loved. A lot of people believe John may still be alive because of a crazy verse like, "What is it to you if he lives until I return?" If you remember that.
I don't remember that. What I could kind of share as like a foundation is that, like, for example, in Mark, he's very misunderstood.
Yeah.
People don't really get him. He has a failed miracle in Mark, which is not in the later Gospels. He gets run out of Nazareth. He's kind of this crazy desert wizard in Mark. And then the Matthean Jesus, the Jesus in Matthew, he's very Jewish. He's obsessed with kind of the law and the prophets and the rituals. And then
Which makes
Luke,
sense because it ultimately accepted that Matthew's audience was Jews.
Matthew was written in Galilee.
Yeah.
We know that from the scholarship and the archaeology. Whereas the Lucan Jesus, the Luke Acts, is all about the Gentiles. It's all about the poor and money and things like that. And then by the time you get to John, which is 100 CE, you could do the dates. So 30, 35, Jesus is killed. Mark is 70 to 75. Matthew's right behind that 70 to 80. Luke is, I think, 80 to 95. And then John is at the earliest 100.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe as late as 125. And even Clement I, who is a very respected church father of the Orthodox, the apostolic tradition, is the first one to call John the spiritual gospel of John, which is a nice little kind of, it's like, it's good. It doesn't mean throw it out because it's very beautiful and it's poetic and has all these symbolic truths, but at the same time, it's much less historical.
And more, you see Christ represented as God, right? Is the deification in John. And the synoptics, the first three, and I'd love to hear your take on this. To me, the revelation is how did the book of Thomas not make it into the canon of Scripture? Because literally, it's like, it looks like they're polling. We know Thomas was written first, right?
We don't know that, but that's my, there's no academic consensus.
Right. I guess you're right. But
there are scholars that say it's the earliest,
So then, and you can see a lot pull from Thomas into the other three. So it's like, and Marcion, I think you talked about this, but certainly we know was one of the early Gnostics that really put the canon of Scripture together.
The first canon is Marcion's.
Who's a Gnostic, which obviously we know going back to the exoteric, they're not a big fan of the Gnostics.
There was all of these different groups, and there was all these different communities writing even within that first century. It was extremely human, it was extremely political, even that early as the writing of the Gospels. And, let's definitely come back to Thomas.
Yeah, but 14:6. Sorry,
so John 14:6.
Look.
So what's funny about John 14:6 is I get John 14:6 commented every day.
Yep.
On my material on Instagram or TikTok. I get it.
It makes sense.
4 days a week.
Yep.
You know, some days 7 or 8 days a week. And the verse is, as every, Christian that's not thrilled with the work I'm doing likes to share, Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So we just explained how, that's in John.
Yeah.
And so we just explained how we know that the Gospels are written in different decades, and John is much later.
Decades, we're talking century in this case.
Well,
right?
John is
almost,
about almost 100 years
later.
after his death.
Which is like when people start to realize this, like we're talking about a book that was written 100 years after Christ's death.
Died,
right?
yeah.
It's like, oh, I have so much I want to say.
I know it's early, but
in retro, early relative to now, but
compared to, I mean, even Mark and Matthew.
It would be like writing about World War I today.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
That would be like, oh, I'm going to write about what happened in World War I today.
Yeah, right. The Roaring 20s.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great point.
Or right after World War I, I guess. But.
Whereas, like, Mark and Matthew were like in the 70s.
Right.
Writing about World War I. It's Hemingway's, Farewell to Arms or whatever. Anyway, so John 14 says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. So we already know that's in John. The other component of this, which I talk about in the book, is the audience that Jesus is talking to is a huge component of the meeting.
100%.
Right? And this is something that, and granted, I haven't gone to church a lot recently, and I kind of got in trouble for saying churches don't talk about this. It was a little like marketing-y of me to say something like that. Churches don't like to talk about this. And some Christians are like, no, we do talk about this. So maybe you guys do.
The Bereans do.
But or the Bible class on Wednesday night does. So, Jesus, he speaks to either very large crowds, Sermon on the Mount. He speaks to kind of smaller groups or kind of smaller, a stranger will kind of ask him a question in like a group, and as kind of the second environment, and then just to the close disciples. There's like kind of the third scene, right?
Yep.
And the first group, the large, the large groups in the crowds, that's like pray to your Father in heaven. Blessed are the poor, the very direct, simplistic stuff that's really good.
And he's admonishing over and over again, spoken parable, let those who have ears to hear, because he wanted to speak deeper truths, but could not because they couldn't get it.
Right, yeah, I think I make the argument that kind of that secondary group, if you will, of kind of a smaller group that doesn't necessarily know him, they're the ones that get the parables.
Especially when he was being challenged. He would respond in parable because
if you said the literal thing,
they couldn't. They'd freak out. They couldn't consciously get what he was saying. Paul said a similar thing in Corinthians. Like, I'd like to give you meat, but I'd have to keep giving you milk because you're not able to get it. Like, you still don't understand. True. Yeah, and the Good Samaritan parable is a great example, which is extremely radical to make the Samaritan the hero of the story, who was a despised ethnic outcast who was just at war with the Jews. So he was doing all of that. He was very radical in teaching. And we wouldn't know that unless you studied Scripture and you understand history. What's like the relevance of what he is saying when he says it. We just think, oh, it's just a poor stranger on the road. Well, now we think Good Samaritan, a hospital. Yeah. It's like totally lost that. So to that point. But so that's the kind of the first and second group. But then the third group is the disciples. The disciples get the heavy, symbolic, spiritual language. They get the true identity, right? Unlike crowds and people who don't know him. They're living with him. When you're living with a spiritual teacher, a master, and that you're getting these truths, that's a different interpretation than the larger crowds and larger audiences. And they still struggled. And they still struggled. Massively. And they still cowered at the transfiguration and everything. And so I'm the way, the truth, and the life. That is in John, which is the last gospel. Yep. And it's to the close disciples only, who get the true identity, who are ready for ideas like, I am the way. It doesn't mean this body. Correct. Right? And in that same passage,
right before that is when he says, before Abraham was, I am. Oh. Right? So I am calling on the timelessness. This is the Christ conscious, the kind of New Age.
And in context, we're not talking about a body. We're talking about...
How could this man, this body, this single person come before the founder of Judaism? 1,500 years earlier. So that's where John 14:6 happens, and the interpretation kind of by Yogananda and other mystics kind of like me is that he's saying, I am the way. Unconditional love. Unconditional love is the way. No one comes to the Father, no one comes to Creator except through unconditional love.
Which was his
Which
teaching.
Is true.
That's 100% his teaching.
Right. So that's the deeper read on 14:6, and it's tough to get that across in an Instagram comment reply. I made a couple of videos about it, but I think it does better in the book and in a podcast, and people who are open to these ideas and things like that get it, and the rigidity of kind of the Christian exclusivity stuff, they're not open to those reads on it. So
which is the exoteric, as you were calling it, religious structures are all about exclusivity, because it really becomes about power. Right. And you see that, like, as I was studying church history from the time Christ was crucified to now, I'm like, does anybody read this stuff? Like, this is clearly a human land grab. This is a power grab, right? And it doesn't mean that, and the language I would use, doesn't mean that God isn't working through that, but I look at religion like scaffolding, which is maybe just a more rough way of saying it than some of the avatars you were explaining, but it's like, it kind of props up the statue or the building while it's being built, but once you have the building, you don't need the scaffolding, right? It's like,
that's great.
There's an old quote that I've always enjoyed that said, "Who can understand Scripture except for the enlightened, and the enlightened don't need Scripture." And it's like there's a lot of deep truth in that. It's like, and for me, what I listen for is not whether somebody knows what I would describe as the book of the Lord, if I'm talking to a Christian, but do they know the Lord of the book? And if you know the Lord of the book, then the book is, I don't want to say meaningless, but it changes how you see it, right? And I explain it like, if my best friend or your best friend was Michael Jordan, right? And you knew him, you hung out with him all the time, you golfed with him, you smoked cigars with him, and you knew how freaking competitive he was. He's this crazy dude. And I go, hey, dude, you know Michael Jordan? That's crazy. Do you know that he's 6'6"? You know he won 6 championships with the Bulls? And I'm like giving you all these stats, and I'm explaining all these things about him, and you're like, you think it's kind of strange that I'm sharing these things? Because you actually know the guy.
Dude.
So you're like, well, yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of cool. Like,
that's
you
funny.
have such a totally different orientation in him.
Right.
For me, that's obvious when somebody knows God, because their orientation to what they talk about totally changes. Yeah. And a lot of Christianese is talking about the book of the Lord, not the Lord of the book, which is one of the reasons I love the Bible, is that it does meet you at your level of consciousness. You can pull out of it whatever you want. You want to see a violent God? It's in there. Right? Like, especially the Old Testament. In fact, there's, I think you brought this up too, but there's some theories, it's like an in-between God. It isn't even the real God in the Old Testament, because it's so fiercely... That's
a Marcion...
belief system that what did he call him?
Yaldabaoth, something like that. The false creator God.
False creator.
Demiurge.
Demiurge, I think is the name. Where it's like, when you study the Old Testament, it's almost like you're talking about a completely different God, right? What I see and kind of how I hold that is, if you're God and you're trying to connect with the human experience, you have to meet them at their level of consciousness. They don't have a way. You have to meet them where they're at. You can't ask them to meet you where you're at, because they don't even have an ability to do that. So you show up in a way that they're going to understand. So when I look at the Bible, what I see is a beautiful love story of God's passionate pursuit of connection with human.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Right? And meeting, and what I see is consciousness as it rises, how he shows up, how she shows up, whatever you want there. Changes, right? And for me, the humility, and I'd love your take on this, I think Christianity is going through a reckoning right now. As a lot of people are like,
isn't it ever?
Yeah, it's like, hey, this isn't really adding up. And part of that is, look, your thoughts on Timothy, and I don't think I disagree with you on the Pauline epistles, but this form of godliness, but denying its power, right? And I think that's where Christianity in the West is.
Yeah.
It's like this form of godliness, but denying its power. It's like the fruit isn't there. So all it really is then is like the Sadducees and the Pharisees of old, right? Like whitewashed tombs. It's like there isn't the
cycles.
Yeah, 100%. It's
Caught
like,
in a loop.
and 100%. There's I would think there'd be humility in that, right? When Christ shows up on the scene, they crucify him because they can't see the very being that had been prophesied in the Old Testament, right? If you believe that, I think there's good reason to believe it. Shows up on the scene and they can't even see him.
Yeah.
Because they're so obsessed with their words, they can't see the truth in front of them. And I've always looked at, and I'm sure you've studied the rhema word versus the logos word, which rhema word is like the living word.
I heard you in that podcast saying that.
And to me, that's it. The living word of God is always being present. It's always, and it's showing up at the level of consciousness. Where we get stuck is when we want to keep going back to the written word or the logos word of God instead of living in the rhema word of God. And the promise in the New Testament is, it says, call unto me and I will answer you, right? And the Holy Spirit in 2 John, like, man, that's my advocation to any Christian. It's like, if something bugs you or something that's just like, no way, this can't be true, just ask the Holy Spirit. If you ask with a pure heart, like, hey, I just want to know. There's some answers that took me 10 years to get, but they eventually were unfolded for me. And to me, that's where I think Christianity is stuck. But I feel a heart, and I wanted to bring you on because there are a lot of really great people in the Christian faith. And I think I think you and Aubrey talked about this, and I agree. Last 2,000 years, if there aren't some real gems in there. Right? You've seen the impact on Western civilization, but it's like, I think it's time to upgrade, right? Our not the Bible, but our way we're looking at it. Yeah. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, I don't know if I've said a lot here, I apologize, but
no.
How do you reconcile this idea of, within the Christian faith, the general belief is it is the inalienable Word of God.
Yeah.
Right? Which is actually, some of that comes from the book of Revelation, which scores very low in consciousness anyway, but is in the final book of the New Testament.
Yeah,
but
I don't pay much mind to it.
I wouldn't. Yeah, especially after chapter 4,
everybody.
it's like, But how do you address that with a Christian that's like, that their whole belief system is, no, it's perfect?
Well, yeah, no, that's a great point. And there's a lot that you said there that I
anyway,
wanted
jump
to
over you, whenever.
Come back to. I think the crumbling of the infallibility doctrine thing has to happen.
What is happening?
It is happening.
I mean, and I have fun with people who are like, that say that. I'm like, well, then why do we have women preaching now? Why are women not growing out their hair anymore? Yeah. Why are women not saved by child? If we really,
that's the historical Jesus, the quest for the historical Jesus, the Bible scholarship that's taken place in the last 150 years. That's probably the best thing that it's done, is to say that if anyone is saying that the Bible's infallible, which a few million, tens of millions of people are,
yep.
They just haven't looked at the text. As soon as you get really
they're not saying
familiar
that from
with the text, you can see the discrepancies, you can see the contradictions across the gospel accounts. That's really my expertise. I talk about, you mentioned the Pauline epistles, the pastoral epistles. I'm still on Aubrey. I said the Pauline epistles, but anyway, I meant the pastoral epistles are the ones that are very. Like the academic consensus is that they're disputed.
First and Second Timothy and
Titus.
Oh, Titus.
Yeah, the TIs.
Yeah.
And there's religious scholars that I can point you to. From Jesus to Christianity by Professor Ellen White, who was one of my mentors, covers it in great detail. I cite his research and basically, for example, Paul's letters that are valid, Timothy is a character. He was a courier of Paul. He was someone who would go on the highway and take Paul's letters and give them to the Roman community, and give them to the people in Corinth. That's what Corinthians is, right? Those are really written by Saul turned Paul of Tarsus. Decades later, maybe longer, when the church continues to kind of progress and become more of this institution, there's, essentially the idea is that the letters of Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, they are written to Timothy, right? He's the recipient. He's this, it's Paul telling Timothy, giving him instructions. And in the authentic letters of Paul, Timothy is he's a beloved kind of son almost to Paul. And in the letters to him, he's admonishing him for his irresponsibility, and he's really railing on him, basically, in the TIs. And kind of secondarily to the personality relationship not matching up, there's also words in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus that are used, like deacon, for example, which is a title in a church that didn't exist in Paul's day. It was much more rudimentary. I mean, in Paul's day, they were like house churches.
Correct.
Just people gathering, in a very informal way. And so to kind of have these roles and things like that are just, it's anachronistic, right? Is the word of the language. So yeah, and yet those are in every Bible, in every hotel's drawer. You have these letters that say this is from Paul, and we know that they weren't written by Paul.
There is a number of books that Paul gets mostly credit for that are still in question. They're just not certain who to give.
There's kind of like a red,
to.
yellow, green.
Correct. Hebrews is another one.
Right.
That I don't think it depends on what translation you get. There's generally an idea that perhaps Paul wrote it, but we're not sure. Yeah. But there's a number of these books. But this
disputed.
Disputed. Yeah. And this is what's funny to me is if you start studying church history, you're like, how can you on one hand go, this is the undisputed, inalienable word of God that is completely accurate and has no fallacies in it, right, or no inaccuracies in it, and yet it was canonized 300 years later, right, in an effort for Rome to unify Rome under a Christian religion.
Yeah.
Right. That alone is fascinating to me.
Right.
And so you're distrusting the dudes that all sat together and decided what books made it and what books didn't. Yeah. Were also
a tyrannical dictatorship.
Right.
And the other thing about what's crazy about the 1st and 2nd Timothy letters is that, what's actually in them? If Paul didn't write them and these later guys said, "Hey, I'm Paul, I'm going to say this." Those are the lines where it says women should not speak in church.
Correct.
Those are the line. There's even a line in
childbearing, which is where the Mormons get the big family idea.
Really messed up stuff is in the pastorals, and
the rapture.
It was very. It was refreshing for me to learn that those are inauthentic. They're forgeries, basically, is what they are, pseudepigrapha, and. There's even a line that says basically slaves should be really good to their masters if the master believes in Jesus. I mean, it's really messed up.
And I don't like to do this to Christians because the other thing is I've also learned to be careful or responsible with how you challenge somebody's worldview.
Well, you're right.
Because if it doesn't get replaced with something else, at least in the short term, it appears that it can do more harm than good.
I'm happy to die on the hill that the pastoral epistles need to be torn out of the book.
100%, yeah.
But at the same time, what you said earlier about kind of not throwing out the baby with the bath.
That's the problem, because as soon as you start, for some, if you start challenging the idea that the Bible is not, it's a man-made Bible, right? Which is not in no way saying that God is not perfect. It's that the human representation of that experience is not perfect. Yeah. But for many in the Christian faith who were, for lack of a better way to put it, brainwashed into believing something, as soon as that breaks,
it's challenged and all. It's very scary.
Everything unravels. Because then it's
scary.
like, what is truth? And the reason it unravels is because I shouldn't say that because maybe I don't know that. I would question how many people have an actual relationship with God that can navigate them through that experience, right? And get untethered so that they can come back to the truth. And the truth is in the Bible, that book, that as soon as the book gets dissolved, then they don't know what to believe. It's like, well, what do I believe at all anymore? So I try to be careful with that. But if somebody wants to go, oh, it's perfect and inalienable, then I'll just start going, right, so slaves are supposed to be good slaves to their masters? Like, wow, they're done. There's like 3 or 4 verses and they're done. They're like, I don't have an answer for that. Like, well, there's a reason.
There's a really good image that is from Brother David Steindl-Rast. That's not in my book.
Fun last name.
It's not in my book. He's a German, I think he's a Benedictine monk, and I was so mad that I read it a year after my book was published. I was like, God, this would have been great. Anyway,
you could update and revise.
He said, the 2.0 original sin is a lie. He said all religions start from mysticism. I'm paraphrasing. He says the image is it's like a volcano. When these religions are formed, let's say all of them, all the major world religions, it's like the power of a volcano, the image of the lava that explodes, this life force, this vitality. Your Jesus, your Buddha, Muhammad, etc. The men and women throughout history who have been extremely connected to spirit, it explodes. And what happens is the lava runs down the mountain, and over the years and decades and centuries and millennia, it becomes dead rock.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that is a pretty darn good analogy for what happens with these religious traditions, because I do firmly believe that, I call him the Avatar of Galilee. I really think that Jesus attained the heights of
100%.
what a human being can do.
100%. I'm with you.
And I'm very, in some ways I've kind of become this Jesus defender.
Right.
Not in the traditional way of what that term means, right? But I'm a huge fan of him. I've devoted a significant amount of my life and years to understanding his teachings. And so, while some of my work is saying, hey, Christians, the Bible's not perfect and these other paths have value, I'm also saying to kind of the secular crowd, to your point earlier, like, hey guys, there's a reason that these religions are still around. There's a real value in scripture and spiritual paths because they have the capacity to be transformational.
100%. And you see that, to your point, which we kind of got off, but you're bringing up somebody who came into Christianity later in their life and found great benefit in that.
Right.
I agree. Especially if it's like, we got some principles here, some values to live by, a structure to make sense of our life.
Yeah. I
think those are all really beautiful things. But for me, the question is, does it bring you closer to the holy instance? Does it bring you closer to God?
Right.
Right. If you're getting stuck in a behavior or getting stuck in a ritualistic process without real connection, then I don't think it's serving its highest purpose. And I on more than one instance, how do I explain this? I've heard multiple times from, we'll say, people who are no longer on earth, that at one point there was a huge discussion, we'll say, around whether or not to canonize the Bible at all, or to allow the Bible to become a book. Because the concern was exactly what you were saying, the volcano that blows up and then over time turns into dead rock. It's like they knew there was a really good chance it would end up being weaponized and being used in ways that it was never intended.
Yeah,
because the further you get away from the source,
I would argue it has.
100%,
right.
100%. You can see that, but it's like there was great debate over do we allow this to happen? Because if this happens, this is the thing. So you see, kind of. Yeah. I'd love to hear your take on this. It's interesting to me. Well, let's go back because you were trying to make a point. I'm jumping around here, but I'm tracking with you. You're trying to make a point about vertical interpretation in the synoptics, the three. Right, when you start looking at those stories as one story from different views, you start to see. Now, one could argue, and I think theologians would, being in these circles enough, would say, well, you're getting different people's perspective, right? Because you have three people sit and witness the same event. Yeah, you're going to see it differently because your perspective is slightly different, which overall I can buy into from a human experience. not so much from a perfect, inalienable God experience.
Yeah.
But that's generally the contention. But you had a point you were trying to make about the vertical interpretation over the last 150 years.
Oh, well, I mean, I would say, I think the main, advantage to civilization that Bible scholarship has presented is the humanness of it all. One of my, I have a list of like discrepancies. I'll point people to Professor Bart Ehrman, UNC Chapel Hill, who's a very prolific Bible scholar. Bart Ehrman kind of does what no scholars do, which is writes popular books very well. So he's kind of, he sells a lot of books, and he's a very, very legitimate Bible scholar and knows Greek and all that. So check out his work. He misquoting Jesus is one of his really good ones about the human formation of the Bibles and like the discrepancies. But there's different people at the tomb. Let's say, for example.
Yep.
Mary Magdalene is in one by herself. It's the women in another one. It's the disciples in another. There's angels at the tomb in one. There's just a soldier in one. There's no one guarding in another one. I mean, there's different kind of like, it's all different, almost like dimensions in terms of the existences of those stories. A really great one too is the flipping of the money changer's temple. In Mark, it's the last moment that gets him arrested.
Yep.
Because the Sanhedrin says, hey, this is a troublemaker flipping tables in our temple, like let's get the Romans here. And in John, it's at the beginning,
right at the beginning
of his ministry.
Yep.
He goes and preaches for multiple years after that. And I even had a guy on TikTok actually that responded to one of those videos and said, it's in there in both of those events in those Gospels because it happened twice. It happened at the beginning, and then he flipped the money changers' tables again. And Bart Ehrman actually mentions that phenomenon in Christian apologetics. He says that would be what's called a super gospel if it happens both times. That would be, you're making like a fifth gospel of all of it together, which neither of those suggest. So, I'm
meaning when you blend the four stories, you create a whole new gospel and timeline by putting them all together.
Right,
yeah.
Which is not what any of them wrote.
Or indicate.
Yeah. Right, or indicate whatsoever. So I don't buy that. I think that it was extremely, like we said earlier, it was very human. They were writing for specific communities. I talk about the condemnation of the Pharisees. I'd be happy to talk about that one with you briefly.
Yeah,
the Pharisees, for anyone who's not familiar, was kind of the rabbinical precursor in the Jewish sect. They're in Jesus' time, they're kind of like running for mayor kind of energy. They're very like concerned with their appearance and surface level stuff. And in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus kind of calls them out. And he says, for example, in one of kind of the authentic teachings, he says, when you're fasting, wear bright, colorful clothing, because it's between you and God.
Right. He's being satirical.
Well, he's saying, don't be like the Pharisees who wear tattered clothing, in order to kind of gain sympathy for their spiritual, prowess. Don't do that. Just, have it's between you and God, basically. It's not to draw sympathy from the crowds, which is a great teaching and like super relevant today on like Instagram and whatever. Anyway, surface level perception.
Giving, serving.
Yeah, it's not how being perceived as this righteous person. And so when you take the section of the New Testament when Jesus is calling out the Pharisees, the condemnation of the Pharisees, you look at the Markan version, the Matthean version, and the Lucan version. Again, in Mark, it's very short. I mean, it's a couple paragraphs, if that. Luke's version, a little bit longer, not much. Matthew's version is like 2 pages. I mean, it just goes on and on and on about the Pharisees. He even, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus even calls them, you den of vipers.
Yep,
which is a really mean thing to say for someone who also said, love your enemies, forgave his killers, lived in this incredible unconditional love. And so, kind of like we were talking earlier, we know that the Matthean gospel is written in Galilee versus the Lucan gospel is written outside the Jewish homeland. So what happens in 70 CE is the Jewish people revolt against the Roman Empire.
Titus shows up.
And the Romans come into Jerusalem, and it is absolutely brutal.
Gnarly.
And it is a massacre. The blood runs through the streets. It's this extreme crisis and tragedy. And the temple's burned and sacked. And so
every stone removed.
And so that is the environment culturally in which the Gospels were written. And so what happened was the Sadducees, who you referenced earlier, who were the Jewish priests of the temple, they're gone now.
Yep.
And now you really just have two primary, the Essenes are off in the desert. They're not long, they don't have much time left either. It's the Pharisees and the Jesus following Jews. And so Matthew's gospel is writing to Jesus following Jews and to kind of the rest of the Jewish population to quite clearly antagonize the other. He uses his main character to antagonize his political foe in order to gain followers. It's very clear. That extended condemnation is not in the Markan or Lucan Gospels, where that political climate doesn't exist. That sectarian division between the Pharisees and the Jesus-following Jews is what's created even in the Gospels themselves, let alone like all the centuries later in the Nicaea. Everyone talks about, the Middle Ages and stuff like the King James Version. Look at when they wrote Matthew. They were already putting political components in here.
So it's super interesting to hear you say that. I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah.
The Mount of Olives, Jesus is sitting with his disciples, and they are like, one, they're confused because they originally thought he was coming to overthrow the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And he's like, yo, this kingdom isn't mine. I'm not here to do anything.
I have another one.
And that threw them off. Yeah. And then he kind of double entendre the statement when he was talking about his own body, and then he was talking about the temple being destroyed, right?
Yeah.
He's like, no, not one stone will stand on the other. Like, it's all going to be pulled apart.
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, when is this going to happen?
Yeah.
And he says, he gives them a whole prophecy, which is in the world of eschatology. I don't know how much you studied eschatology, but the world of eschatology in the Christian church, that's a fundamental belief system to this in-time prophecy that somewhere in the future this diabolical event's going to take place.
Yeah.
But that did happen, right? What he prophesied, right, as we would say, did happen. And unless you're saying, well, we were actually talking about it after the fact. But in Matthew, he literally prophesies that temple was going to be destroyed. And it really was, Rome sacking Israel that, one, hindered the Jewish religion from continuing to grow, and at the simultaneous time allowed Christianity grow, because they knew to get the hell out of town. He's like, hey, if you see these things happening, grab your tunic and run. Or don't even grab your tunic, run, because Rome is coming to sack Israel, right? And that's the that's the portrayal. And I've always thought that was a fairly, whether, if I'm hearing you right, you're kind of saying, well, this was written as a historical account and was probably written after these events happened. And that could very well be, and I could hear what you're saying there. I've always looked at it like he's giving them warning to get out of Israel because these things were going to happen. And they were totally confused and frustrated by his statement. Like what do you mean this is going to happen? And that's exactly what happened. And if you look at it historically, and I think you see this, when Rome sacked Israel, Christianity spread like wildfire because they got out. Whereas Judaism, which was highly suppressing Christianity, right at the time, it was the biggest persecutor of Christianity, got demolished. It was suppressed massively by the Romans, and then Christianity just went in all directions. Yeah, which was the fulfillment of Paul's work, right? That was like what Paul talked about.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible scholars tend to point more towards the fact that those temple references are the gospel writers themselves. I personally, kind of from the mystic's view, interpret a lot of Jesus' teachings from this kind of mystic, non-dual lens.
Yep.
And kind of the prophecying stuff isn't really what I'm interested in or able to really account for. I mean, even, for example, he curses the fig tree in Mark.
Which is confusing to people.
No one gets that. And I've even seen I've seen atheist marches or whatever where it says God hates figs,
right.
Which is a funny thing. But because of what he says in Mark about this tree shall never bear fruit, he's talking about the temple.
Yeah.
Guys, he's talking about institutional, old school,
100%,
kind of wooden religion, his religion, as a Jewish teacher. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of, it's hard to know what the gospel writers added on, of course. I think this might be a good segue into Thomas, which was found in 1945. We knew that Thomas existed. And so if anyone is not familiar with the Gospel of Thomas, do yourself a favor, Google the Gospel of Thomas right now. You can read it for free. It's 117 sayings of Jesus. And we knew it existed because church fathers wrote about it and they said, this is one of the not real ones, or suppress this one. We knew it was mentioned in church correspondence, but we never had it. What happened was an Egyptian shepherd in the 1940s was chasing a goat and ran under this boulder outside of Nag Hammadi and found, I believe it was 13 codices, which are leather-bound books. They're some of the earliest leather-bound books that we have in civilization. They're not scrolls. And it was about 50 different texts. Plato's Republic is in there, which is kind of a fun fact. And there's a couple of, it's a Hellenistic collection, but the Gospel of Thomas is arguably the most significant find. It's one of the most kind of significant finds of the 20th century. And, there's a lot of exciting things about Thomas. One is, it even starts off by saying these are the hidden sayings of Jesus as recorded by Didymus Thomas the twin, which is exciting as the opener. But what's cool about it to me is really two things. 117 sayings, there's no plot points, right? And so if you look at, if you have two texts based on an ancient teacher, and one of them is just a list of Jesus said, blah, blah, blah. It's just saying 30, saying 77. And then you have the Gospels, which are very sophisticated narratives. They have plot points, they have events, all this stuff. Just textually, it's pretty clear what came first. And then kind of on top of that, you have, I believe it's 70 something. It's 2/3 let's say. 2/3 of the 117 sayings have parallels in Matthew and Luke. Not really in Mark and not really in John. A little bit in John. And in the Thomasine versions, they're simpler. In Matthew and Luke, there's a little more added to it. And, that's kind of proof enough for me. A lot of Christians are become very, angry and frustrated with the idea that Thomas is earlier than the Gospels. But there's no scholarly consensus. Some scholars think it's 150, 200. Some say 100 around John. Some say contemporary with Paul, which is what I think.
So in the frame, what makes you think, so that we can, for our listeners, what makes you think that it would have come earlier? Because it's simpler and it's not in story?
There's no story. There's no plot points. It kind of has that energy of being scribbled down. Like Jesus said this, Jesus said this, Jesus said this. There's no, even Mark, the simplest gospel, has a very complex story, and, symbolic moments and all this stuff. Thomas has none of that. It's just bullet points.
What about that makes
structure.
you think that would indicate that it came earlier, not later?
Yeah, because what about that? Just the more simplistic, the more rudimentary style textually. But then secondarily, like I said, for example, it has the mustard seed. It has the wedding garment. It has tell me what I'm like. It has a lot of the greatest hits are in Thomas. And, the wedding garment is one that I make a comparison of at the end of the book. The Thomas version, kind of back to the vertical reading thing, the Thomas version, the Lucan version, and the Matthean version. And just read them. Go online and read the wedding garment in Thomas, in Luke, and Matthew, or you can order Original Sin is a Lie and read it in my book, because I put them in there. But yeah, there's a lot more to the story in Luke, and there's much more to the story in Matthew. It's much simpler in Thomas. And so it seems pretty clear, Sebastian, that the gospel writers are adding on more details to these original stories for their own means, for their own aim.
Have you read the Book of Enoch?
I'm not familiar enough with it. Yeah, the Apocrypha is very, you could spend a lifetime studying it all. And I will say, you talked about canonization earlier. I'll even say, as a mystic, kind of Gnostic leaning, whatever that labelless spiritual fan of all this stuff, I get why they canonized the documents. They were writing hundreds,
right?
This Jesus guy was so popular that people were going, oh, and then this gospel stuff, and there's like real kind of church leaders going, oh boy, this is getting out of hand.
You're getting all sorts of variations of a story, and it's
right.
We got to
we got to find which ones are the real deal. So I get that, and I honor that, And again, Marcion's, a Gnostic teacher, was the first one to do that, because it's necessary to kind of say these are legit and these ain't, but. They took it too far, and they found the Gospel of Mary Magdalene in Nag Hammadi Library. Unfortunately, it's just about 2 pages. I wish maybe one day we'll find the whole thing, but the 2 pages are out of control. What we found.
Give us some of the highlights.
Well, what happens is Mary Magdalene comes back from talking to Jesus, and she starts to tell Peter and the disciples about what Jesus told her. And Peter gets upset because it is much more advanced philosophy than he's been told, and the rest of the disciples have been told. She starts explaining, which is something you touched on, I think, in that podcast with Ryan, about spirit and soul, and the difference, kind of this cosmological layers of the astral realms. Is very fascinating. You can also look up Gospel of Mary Magdalene online, and it'll take you 25 minutes to read it, so check it out. That's the first half is kind of Mary saying, well, the master said all this. And Peter, then the second half is Peter being frustrated and kind of calls her a liar, and the disciples say, well, wait a second, Peter. We haven't been told anything like on that level. Why are you, And so there's kind of this dispute, and it's almost like this perfect little encapsulation of the early church and the apostolic traditions' insecurity about her proximity to him. Yeah.
Take Mary out of it, you see that precedent, how Jesus shows up to the disciples differently after he is resurrected. After his resurrection, he shows up to them differently. And Peter is, kind of broken by that experience. He's like, Peter, do you love me? He's like, what do you mean, do I love you? Why are you asking me this? Right? Peter, do you love me? And he's like, but why are you asking me this? Peter, do you love me? He asked him 3 freaking times. Right? And he's just totally broken by this. Broken in like just, why are you having to ask me this question? And you can see the dynamic of those relationships. I think it's a beautiful passage, because he's really addressing and dealing with, but right before in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's like, you're going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows. And he's like, well, I'm not going to deny you. Yeah. Right? And it's exactly what he does. So he's coming back to, I think that's why he asked him 3 times for every time that he denied him. And it's a really beautiful exchange, but you can see the dynamic and the different relationships. And then, of course, doubting Thomas. And so
Yeah.
I don't have a hard time with seeing those. You're going to teach to the level of the consciousness of the person that you're talking to.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you said doubting Thomas, because doubting Thomas is in the Gospel of John.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
there's a nice little kind of piece from scholarship that the Johannine community was in a dispute and conflict with the Thomasine community.
And this is their
Because the John folks were not thrilled with the Gospel of Thomas and his close proximity to Jesus. So in John's Gospel, Thomas is maligned.
Thomas.
So yeah, it's a very like Shakespearean Game of Thrones whole scene, with the relationships.
So just pivoting away from the Bible here.
Yeah.
So you spent some time in and around the church.
So anyway, the Buddha.
Also good.
Also good. So you spent some time in and around the church, but then you started looking for answers, and I think I think you said this in your book, that you started reading.
Yeah, I read Living Buddha. I read
Buddha.
Living Buddha, Living Christ by Thich Nhat Hanh, like
When you were like
14,
11 or
15,
okay, so
something.
you're super
yeah.
young.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I love that you did in your book, and anybody who's gotten this far and is still interested, go check out his book. I think it's
Thanks,
fantastic. Original Sin is a Lie. And I love the title. So there's a couple different, Original Sin is a big one for me.
Yeah.
Hell, which you address.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think there's only 2 or 3 times in the New Testament in which hell is generally considered Hades, right? We know that from in Greek, and I think it's only mentioned 2 or 3 times. The other word is it
Gehenna.
Gehenna, yeah, which is really like more like a trash heap or like a
Landfill.
landfill.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because there's this idea of hell is also a really big deal to Christians.
Right.
And you see this, especially in the last 120 years when you start studying church history, Hal Lindsey, the late great Planet Earth, this like drive to fear people into believing in God, right? And, and to be fair, you see this earlier that with the Catholic Church, but I want to weave into Eastern religion here.
Yeah, sure.
But one of the things to me that I think is so interesting, and these were answers that came to me later. One of them was reincarnation. When I was younger, which is super hilarious as I just begin to remember more about myself. But when I was younger, I really had this thing with like reincarnation could not be a thing. I have no idea how I thought that or why I thought that, because now I'm the exact opposite. It's like, how could it not be a thing? Like, to me, it's so self-evident and obvious. And I think there's thousands of documented cases now. If anybody's super interested on this topic, just go look. It's like, you don't have 6-year-old children speaking dead languages or ancient languages out of nowhere, or like recognizing, people on a boat that they were on and knowing everybody's name. There's too many documented cases. But I'd love to hear your take, first of all, on reincarnation, if you wouldn't mind, your thoughts on that, or how you look at that, and how you reconcile those pieces, or what your thoughts on it, and then kind of transition into, like in your book, you did such a great job of showing, which is going to annoy the hell out of a lot of Christians, pun intended, how they're all kind of saying the same thing.
Yeah, they really are.
For a different audience, but the same thing. Because, man, when I start talking to people in the Christian community, you can literally see their skin begin to crawl. They're like, they're not the same thing. Like, you studied the book?
At the root of the traditions, they're really beautiful. It's called the perennial philosophy, right? So Aldous Huxley wrote this book, the famous British novelist and
Brave New World.
Yeah, genius kind of intellectual of the middle 20th century, and the perennial philosophy. He basically, religious scholarship, comparative religion, saying, gosh, they all talk about love, they all talk about silence, they all talk about, compassion, forgiveness, all these beautiful things. And when you study the world religious traditions and really the mystics, kind of coming back to the mystics, the exoteric and the esoteric, right? So the institution and then kind of the non-institutional religious, or sometimes they're called the contemplatives, typically monastics. They sound very similar, eerily similar. There's a section too in the book that I talk about called the avatars, where I compare specifically the teachings of Jesus, the Buddha, and Krishna. And the Buddha even says almost word for word, what you reap is what you sow.
Yep.
Right, that classic line from the New Testament. There's a parable in the Lotus Sutra, I believe it's the Lotus Sutra or the Heart Sutra, it's one of those two, that essentially has the parable of the prodigal son. Once you really look at these traditions, it's like, oh my gosh. I think it's, in terms of reincarnation, the Hindus call it samsara, the wheel of samsara. Like there's this idea that, we're just kind of going around and around this kind of cosmic carousel. We were part of the one and then split off. The idea around kind of consciousness, the conscious split from creator, and kind of coming back into oneness. We're all just on this big wheel, undoing our separateness. Throughout time.
Undoing our separateness.
Right? Yeah. So that's really, that's kind of the mystical worldview. And, I'm into it. Although I will say, you and I talked about this a little bit, I think the other day, about non-duality, which is maybe too much to get into tonight. I don't know. We could also do a part 2, but non-duality is essentially just means not two. And a lot of the mystics have kind of non-dual components, but even Jesus says, for example, if thine eye be single, your body will be full of light. I think there's little moments in the religious traditions that the kind of lay people they have no idea what that means. Yeah. If thine eye be single, well, that means when you see one in everything, when you see no separation, your body will be full of light. That's called enlightenment. That's the same thing as what these Eastern traditions are talking about. And also, just kind of full circle here with Thomas, we talked about the similarities. Well, 2/3 are kind of in the other ones. What's the other third? What's in Thomas that's not in Matthew and Luke? Yeah. Pretty much everything that's not in Matthew and Luke that's in Thomas sounds like it should be in the Upanishads. Jesus says, split a block of wood and I'm there. Pour out a bucket of water and I'm there. It's almost this kind of pantheistic belief, and it's like, oh, that didn't make it in the Bible.
Like chop wood,
but carry water has a very Buddhist energy, yeah. So yeah, man, it's all the same.
How do you reconcile, and maybe you don't, but when you're talking to, well, I guess, let's back up. Why did you write Original Sin is a Lie? You talked about it, I think you weren't recording, but just so.
Yeah, I was really surprised and refreshed as hell to learn that the Bible is not infallible. Yeah. And that really, I guess, kind of to come back to like the title of the book, pretty much all of the issues with Christianity, or all the things about Christianity that I had an issue with, like original sin, for example, was a later tradition.
Yeah.
And everything that I was really into, like love your enemies, that's more historically like
closer to the source. Which is fascinating because you don't really see that get a lot of attention, right?
Love your enemies.
Love your enemy.
Yeah. Like, you really don't.
We're not spending a lot of time on that. We want to argue over the bullshit that is much later.
Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do.
One of the most powerful, it just seems,
lines in humanity.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I really liked, and it also kind of, again, to that earlier point around like secular folks being like, oh no, a lot of my friends are creatives in Austin, Texas, and I work in tech, and it's like people are kind of this is a post-religious world, right? And so
postmodernism,
post-Christian America.
Yeah.
So
in Western civilization,
it's a real joy for me to say, well, actually, check this out. So that's
and
basically
I think part
what
of
the
that
book
is because I think a lot of people want something to believe in,
yeah,
and have a framework to make sense of their life. I don't think we do very well as a species without meaning. Right? Like we're dealing in, we're in the middle of an existential crisis in our society right now, because without meaning, it's like you have mental health issues, you turn to sports, which I love, but just crazy things to like try to create meaning in your life. Yeah, whatever it is, right? Because we want to have meaning, and without it, we get untethered. Yeah. And there is a moment in time, I think, in the human experience where being untethered is incredibly important. But I think a lot of what we're seeing in our society right now is because we have this kind of nihilistic view of the world. It's becoming more culturally pervasive in the middle of an existential crisis. But when people try to turn to Christianity, it's like, man, there's just too much in it that doesn't fit. It doesn't it hurts more than helps.
It kind of became this big dilapidated, the Charlie meme on It's Always Sunny, where he kind of looks crazy and he's drawing on the poster. That's kind of what modern Christianity is. Just we have to do this thing, It just became this something way different. And I think there's a lot of, also at the same time, you're having people kind of this renaissance of Buddhism and mindfulness, which has been really profound and beautiful. And there's a great book called Why Buddhism is True, by Robert Wright, which is another edgy title, where he basically says a lot of kind of Buddhist psychology is in line with behavioral psychology.
100%.
To a spooky degree. When you're always clinging, what the Buddhist says is life is suffering, but what he really means is the material world is the word is dukkha, not suffering. It means unsatisfactory, right? So it's the material world is not going to satisfy you. I can't get no satisfaction. Mick Jagger and the Buddha, right? And it's that's really that people are understanding that. They're saying, oh wow, I can never, I'll run out of money on the slots, or I'll, this lover will leave me, or, whatever it is, or my parents will die, or, the material world doesn't have it. So what you do is you undo your expectation of the material world to undo the suffering. And,
surrender expectation and find the answer inward.
Exactly.
That is the work.
There's really practical, advice from these systems.
If I want to teach spirituality and spiritual technology, if I will, I'm more likely to go into Buddhist teaching if it doesn't just come from my own understanding. Christianity, I like from a value standpoint, perhaps a meaning standpoint, but certainly solid values, but doesn't do a whole lot to teach practical spirituality. Yeah. Buddhism is freaking fantastic at practical spirituality. Yeah. And so I think you're seeing that rise again. It was wow, meditation really does work. It does change your life. And growing up in the church, my favorite part of church very often was prayer and worship and meditation, because that was, to me, is when I was getting into the highest ecstatic states. Yeah. Right. And that's worship is a form of meditation. Prayer is certainly a form of meditation. I've always enjoyed that. Right. And so I think what we're seeing is, maybe I'm optimistic, but a multidisciplinary approach to the truth of what is, what has always been, and that deep remembering. And going way off tangent here.
No, well said. That's beautiful. Yeah, and the last thing that I maybe will add to this in terms of kind of values from the East that I really appreciate, they're called the yogas, right? The Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga. So yoga just means union. Yeah. It just means path of union with the divine, and kind of, I guess, maybe pointing out Buddhism and Christianity from this perspective of in Hinduism, the idea of the yogas is this really varied look at different psychodynamic needs and psycho-emotional needs. So Jnana Yoga, Jnana, means kind of intellectual, mental pursuit. I think the Buddha was a jnana yogi, basically. You're just undoing intellectually. You're saying, Sri Ramana said, neti neti, I am that, or I'm not this, that's neti neti. No, I'm not this. And it's just this kind of almost colder analytical process, right? But it's valid.
We could
valid
say
path to God.
a left brain process, if
Right,
they wanted
exactly.
to, or a mentalization, or an analyzing of.
Exactly.
And then that's by subtraction, right? Not this is to figure out. And I use this as a practice in my coaching practice to help people figure out very often what they want or who they are. In many cases, it's easier to do
Negate
that by subtraction, right? I'm definitely not this. I'm not this. So then you do that enough, and it's like, well, what is left?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And that is the work.
That's great. That's beautiful. And the second kind of yoga is called bhakti yoga, or a bhakta, and that's that tends to be more Christian. It's kind of the prayer, worship, devotion, song, dance. The Sufis in Islam, kind of poetry and dance and music. Rumi is a bhakti. Some people say Jesus was a bhakti. I think he was a little bit of both, probably, but
he seemed to be able to meet different groups where they were
Where
at.
they were
so
at.
whether he was that or not,
maybe he might have just transcended the whole scene,
100%,
probably.
yeah,
But,
and just connected with where the people were.
But yeah, so you have bhakti yoga, and and then karma yogi means like service, so like feeding people, which is in all traditions. And then you have Raja Yoga, which is kind of this culmination. Maybe that's what Jesus was. But, when the Bhaktis, for example, look at the Yanis, they say, oh, these guys are just so cold and intellectual, and they need to sing a song. And the Yanis look at the Bhaktas and they go, God, they're just crazy dancing around. What the hell are they doing? And that's a really nice way of, the West doesn't really have that framework. It's kind of all or nothing. In Christianity, in Islam, and Judaism, you kind of, this is the way it is. You say these rules, and this is the thing. And the East has that kind of buffet line quality to it.
In an acceptance. Acceptance. Because if you look at church history and you look at the different denominations, I would say what you just described shows up within the different denominations of Christianity.
Yeah.
Though they're not all very accepting of one another. They certainly have those expressions, right? More that are more into, in the Christian world, we'd call more into the gifts of the Spirit. Others that are more like the Bereans, line upon line, precept upon precept, they're more about the written word and very intellectual.
That's true, and that's a great point. And I will say though, my counter to that would be, it's unfortunate that it's not on an individual level. It's on a community level. It becomes sectarian, as opposed to kind of us and themness, as opposed to, oh, that's a great way to, you want to go up that way? Do that. It's like, no, we're a Methodist family.
Right. Or you're a Presbyterian.
Yeah.
I would say that tends to be a human experience more than a religious experience, though, where there's
the tribalistic.
Tribalistic view of like the world is the way I see it.
Yeah.
Right. Like this is the way it is.
Yeah. That's fair.
Which is part of the human experience, I think. So I had a really cool experience, I thought. I did 5-MeO, which is the strongest known hallucinogenic known to man currently.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it was a random.
It's like DMT times
10.
10?
Yeah, it's like a.
Oh my word!
It's its own thing. But I'll be quick here. But it was to create a frame. I thought it was really interesting, and so I've done shrooms a number of times. I love shrooms. It's fantastic. And for me, it's always feeling like I just go.
Can you not tell I'm on them? No, I'm just kidding.
Don't tell me. But for lack of a better way of putting it, I felt compelled, led to have this experience. I did it by myself, not with somebody who walked me through the experience, but I just went and met this dude. Pretty interesting. And I drop in. Shrooms will take like 30 minutes. 45 minutes when he's done, you just kind of comes on nice, and it's a gentle teacher. Right? 5-MeO is like you can't count down to 10.
Wow.
You're out. You just, in fact, you breathe it in, and then the guy
the exhale is tough.
And as you exhale, you just, and I left my body just gone. It was an awesome experience for me, but so I'm hanging out in another realm. I don't know how else to explain that. I saw my body as I left it. I'm like, whew. And I'm hanging out with this dude who at the time I did not know. I know now I know who he is. And we're just we're friends and we're talking and we're connecting. And I'm like, this is so awesome. And I start to come back in, and my guide, who was sitting at the edge of this thing I was laying on, he goes, "Who are you talking to?" And I go, "What's your name?" And he goes, "What do you mean, my name? I'm Ram Dass." And at the time, I didn't know who Ram Dass was. I hadn't studied any of his work.
Wow.
And so I say, "I'm talking to Ram Dass." The dude, this was a couple years ago. Dude goes,
It's wild.
he goes, "He's dead." And I start laughing, and then Ram Dass starts laughing. He goes, "I'm not dead, you idiot. I just left my body."
Wow.
And so we start laughing at how funny we think it is that he doesn't get this. So I'm having this whole conversation. I'm going somewhere with this, I think. So then, like, we're having this exchange, and it wasn't really about anything deep. We were mostly just like deep belly laughter, like just the humor of life. It wasn't like any profound conversation I can remember. But then this other dude showed up, and it was interesting because I didn't know who he was either, other than I knew who he was. I didn't know anything about him. But when I was in Bali, I went to all the Hindu temples. I thought they were amazing and beautiful. I also felt this like familiarity with the place that was super interesting to me. But one of the gods was Ganesh, who's an elephant god, right?
Yeah.
And he shows up.
Wow.
And we're like rapping, and I'm like getting all these downloads. I thought it was so interesting, but we started talking about incarnation and instances of life. And that was what was super interesting to me, that these two guys that I didn't really have much knowledge of at the time, I go hang out with, and it wasn't
In a completely embodied
different
way.
Yeah,
almost.
totally. And it was when I was with them, it was like I'd always known them, but it was a remembering for me in this lifetime, which was super fascinating to me. And the whole experience was like 40, 50 minutes, but it felt like 5 minutes. It felt so incredible. But I wanted to touch on this because the thing that I think I see coming up right now is the use of psychedelics to get some of these experiences.
Yeah.
Which for me, I'm not opposed to, clearly. But my concern is the same with all religious activity, which is you find seekers in every group.
Right.
Right. And for me, I've always felt connected in this particular lifetime. I've always felt connected to God. I didn't have to find God in this lifetime. I didn't know, God, do you exist? I dropped in with total awareness of that I had to understand human, and I had to understand religion. So I studied all the religions because I'm like, how do you guys interface with God? Like, that was bizarre to me. But I'm seeing so much work getting done with psychedelics that's like jumping
the Renaissance,
people.
if you will.
It's like people are like getting clear on stuff super quick. So what's your opinion or thoughts on that? Or do you have any experiences of or opinions around?
Yeah, I have a chapter in the book about psychedelia, and
I haven't gotten there yet.
It's sort of the second half. Okay. So I talk about Terry McKenna, who's a big psychonaut pioneer. Yeah, he's great, and Ram Dass, and actually Aldous Huxley, who wrote Perennial Philosophy, wrote The Doors of Perception, from which the Doors got their name. And I think it's a very powerful tool. And I think that...
Do you see in Eastern religion any use of or precedent for psychedelics?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, a buddy of mine sent me his book called The Psychedelic Origin of Religion, and he talks about, he basically kind of hypothesizes or theorizes certain rituals that were very likely psychedelic chemicals and things like that. There's one called Soma in ancient Vedic,
for sure.
which we don't know what it was, but we kind of have an idea, and so
by description, you get the idea.
It's like when I went to Bonnaroo in 2008. I'm pro psychedelics. It's also very important to call out set and setting to me, and I think the West we do it at a party, which is terrible, and a music festival, which is pretty bad. Doing it around a campfire is probably the best, or in your room by yourself, and not leaving is key. But also, it's not the end all be all, and I think that there's
100%.
People are realizing that it's a glimpse, and Ram Dass's own life to bring it back to your spirit
As
guide.
he got older, he references that, right?
Yeah, in his later years, he said, it wasn't about, when I would get high, I would always come down.
Yeah.
He said, it's not about getting high, it's about getting free.
Yeah. Oh,
great.
That was in, I forget which one is
Grist for the Mill, I think, days. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what happened was, too, he met this guru, Neem Karoli Baba. I write about these guys in the book. I got their permission. Thanks, Hanuman Foundation. Neem Karoli Baba was this very kind of, he was like a miracle Baba. He didn't really have teachings. Some Hindu gurus like write books like Yogananda and things like that. Neem Karoli Baba kind of just lived his life. He would do miraculous people, and he generated compassion and things like that, fed people. But he didn't really have like teachings. Anyway, the story, I won't spoil it, the story of how Ram Dass met Maharaji Neem Karoli Baba is amazing, and it's worth really appreciating and getting to know in kind of the spiritual pantheon. But what happened was, Ram Dass, after they met, a few days later, he had some LSD on him. And one of the reasons he was traveling the world was to try to find out if anybody knew in the spiritual world about LSD or about psychedelics, because, they had become obsessed with it at Harvard, and that's why he got thrown out.
Richard Alpert.
Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary and those guys. And Neem Karoli Baba, unprompted, asked Ram Dass, pre-Ram Dass, as Richard Alpert, he said, "Give me the medicine." And he said, "What? I don't know what you're talking about." And he says, "Give me the medicine." His traveling companion said, "He probably means the acid, man." And he goes, "Oh, shoot, okay." And so he pulls out, I think it was called like White Lightning or something. It was like a pretty strong batch. And he gives him one tab, which was a nice amount. And he says, "Keep it, come on." And this is an old Indian man, who's probably never done it before, right? 2, which would be 600 micrograms. I'm not sure. I think it was micrograms. 600, 3, 900, 4, 1200, which I think it was around like 150. It would be enough to, so 1200. He watches him swallow all 4, and he's kind of shocked at this. But he said the scientist in him was like, okay, this is going to be good to see what happens. And, the story goes famously that nothing happened. He just kind of smiled. And I think he would kind of, he went through the rest of the day normally, but he would kind of like do like a crazy face and like freak him out, but then just be totally fine. And, there's actually a prologue to this. So when he came back and wrote Be Here Now, he told that story so much, and people kind of doubted it, nothing happened to this guy, you sure? And then he began to doubt it. And there's another book called Miracle of Love, 1,000 Stories About Neem Karoli Baba. And it's good. It's worth thumbing through. And in that book, he talks about how when one of the times we went back, he did it again. Because he knew, Maharaji felt the doubt in the original thing, and he said, let's really be sure. And like some other guy came up, and there was a watch, and they did it again, and I think it was even more the second time. And again, nothing happened. And basically what he says is, when you're in Detroit, you don't have to take a bus to Detroit. Maharaji, these beings are operating up here. We're here. And acid is here. Psychedelics are here. Kind of back to the Hawkins thing. There's all these levels. So if your consciousness is here, you're not going to feel anything from that. I think I like to tell that story because, to your point, we are in this like psychedelic spiritual renaissance. I know so many people that are like going to Costa Rica to drink the Aya, and that's really cool. Mostly, I think it's really interesting, and I hope that on like a political level and kind of a late stage CAP level, I hope that folks do it fairly, because there's like this history of colonial bullshit and indigenous people that get taken advantage of by opportunists, and that's frustrating, obviously, but it seems like it's mostly good. The fact that this is becoming
Agreed.
more
And there seems to be
accessible.
more conscious awareness to protect.
It seems like
It
it.
seems like
Hopefully,
it, yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
we're echo chamber a little bit, but
Yeah.
so I'm mostly excited about it all, and also at the same time, it's just a glimpse. It's just a tool, and
It's another path, another tool.
Yeah.
I look at it like the book of the Lord, right?
Yeah.
Medicine is just another way, but
Yeah.
if it doesn't get you to know God, right, and to remember, then to me it's just as useless as any other tool. And
Right.
and the seeker community gets into things for the sake of the experience, not the understanding.
Right.
But you see that there's nowhere to judge. You see that in everything, as far as I can tell. All religions have that community, right?
Yeah.
It's like they're not really interested in the learning; they're interested in the experience. So,
Here, here.
yeah, yeah. Well, this has been epic. I've really enjoyed this conversation, my friend.
Yeah, brother.
We'll have to do round 2 at some point.
Yeah, that'd be
Because
great.
There's a lot we could have gotten into. But just so people can find you, where's the best place to find you?
Probably originalsinisalie.com is like the site that kind of holds everything. I'm Original Sin is a Lie on TikTok and Instagram are kind of my main two.
And for Christians listening to this, I would say pay attention if you're triggered by anything we've talked about.
Yeah.
And as I always say, call upon the Holy Spirit,
Yeah.
right, using Christian language, to guide you into understanding. He promises he will in 2 John. And go get the book. At least you'll become more educated, even if it's more educated on things that you don't agree with. Go read things that will challenge you. You'll learn a lot about yourself, and I thought you did a fantastic job. I'm halfway through it, but what I've read so far, I've really enjoyed how you put it together and showed in a way that hopefully creates a multidisciplinary approach to the truth, which is God, right? Which is, I would say, the isness. And so I really enjoyed it. I appreciate you being on today, brother.
Thanks so much, man. Appreciate it. And
Boom.
yeah, the water is just fine.
Yeah.
Come on in, guys.
The water's just fine.
Cheers.